My stepdad isolated me from my mom for years and told me she didn't need me anymore. Now, he's the one getting kicked out. My mom married Larry when I was 15. He seemed decent at first, bought me video games, took us out to dinner, acted like he wanted to be a family. That lasted about 6 months. Once the wedding was over, he started making rules about when I could talk to my mom. Said she was tired from work and didn't need me bothering her with teenage problems. If I tried to tell her about school, he'd interrupt saying we were being too loud. If she tried to help me with homework, he'd suddenly need her for something urgent. By the time I left for college, I barely had a relationship with her. Larry always answered her phone, always had excuses why she couldn't talk. She's sleeping, she's busy, she's not feeling well. When I'd come home for breaks, he'd plan trips for just the two of them that happened to overlap with my visits. Mom would apologize but say Larry had already paid for everything. I'd spend holidays alone in my childhood home while they went to resorts. After graduation, I got a job 3 hours away. Tried to visit Mom once a month, but Larry made it impossible. He'd say they had plans, the house was being fumigated, Mom had a headache. When I'd call, he'd put me on speaker and hover over the conversation. If Mom mentioned missing me, he'd change the subject. Tell her about some cruise he wanted to book or restaurant he wanted to try. One Sunday, I drove down without warning. Mom answered the door and burst into tears when she saw me. We hadn't been alone in 2 years. She started telling me how much she missed me, how Larry wouldn't let her call, how he'd hidden her phone. Then Larry came home. He pulled me outside and said Mom didn't need me anymore. Said she had him now and I was just making her feel guilty about living her life. Said grown kids shouldn't be hanging around their parents like parasites. Told me to stop coming by unless invited. I asked Mom about it later and she said Larry was just protective. That he loved her so much he wanted all her attention. She asked me to give him space and maybe visit less. I could see she was choosing him, so I stopped trying. Didn't call for 3 months. Then Mom's sister Rita called me. Said Mom was in the hospital with pneumonia and had been asking for me. Larry hadn't told anyone. I drove straight there and found Mom alone in a room, looking 20 pounds lighter. Larry hadn't visited once in 4 days. The nurses said no one had come to see her. When I asked Mom why Larry wasn't there, she said he was busy with work. But Rita did some digging and found out Larry had been laid off 6 months ago. He'd been lying to Mom, spending her money while pretending to work. That's why he didn't want me around. I might notice things. I stayed with Mom for a week. During that time, I found out Larry had taken out credit cards in her name, maxed them out, and was hiding the bills. He'd convinced her to add him to her retirement account and had withdrawn $30,000. He'd sold her jewelry and told her she must have misplaced it. He'd been isolating her so she wouldn't have anyone to talk to about the missing money. When Mom got home, I confronted Larry with bank statements. He said it was none of my business what happened between husband and wife. Said I was jealous of their relationship. Said Mom wanted him to manage the finances. Mom was sitting right there and said she never agreed to any of it. Larry got nasty then. Said Mom was confused from the medication. Said she'd been forgetting things lately. Started suggesting she might need professional help for memory issues. That's when Mom snapped. Told him to get out. He laughed and said the house was half his now. She said she'd changed her will while in the hospital and he wasn't getting anything. He could stay until the divorce was final, but that was it. Larry's jaw dropped. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Dropped. He stood there in the living room, mouth working like he couldn't figure out what words to use. Mom kept her eyes locked on him, not backing down for the first time since I'd been back. He started to say something about how she couldn't do this, but she cut him off and told him to pack his essentials and get out by the end of the week. He tried the guilt trip again, saying she was throwing away 7 years like they meant nothing. Mom stood up from the couch, walked past him to the bedroom and shut the door in his face. I heard the lock click. Larry looked at me like I was supposed to do something, maybe convince Mom to change her mind. I told him he had 5 seconds to walk away before I called the cops for trespassing. He grabbed his jacket off the chair and left without another word. I stayed with Mom for the next 3 days while Larry packed his stuff. He moved around the house like a ghost, trying to catch Mom alone to talk, but she refused to be in a room with him unless I was there too. Rita came by every evening after work with dinner and helped us go through the financial mess. We found 2 more credit cards Larry had opened in Mom's name, bills stuffed in the back of his closet behind the winter coats. Another $15,000 we didn't know about. Mom sat at the kitchen table staring at the statements, and I watched her hands shake as she added up the total damage. Rita suggested we meet with her friend Orla, who handled divorces involving money problems. Mom agreed without hesitation. On the 4th day, Larry's brother showed up with a truck. I watched from the window as they loaded boxes and garbage bags full of clothes. Larry kept looking back at the house like he expected Mom to come running out and stop him. She stayed in her bedroom with the door locked until his truck pulled away. When I knocked and told her he was gone, she opened the door and just stood there staring at the empty driveway. Then she started crying. these big, awful sobs that shook her whole body. I held her on the couch for over an hour while she let it all out. She kept saying sorry over and over, apologizing for pushing me away and choosing him. I told her Larry was the one who should be sorry, not her. The house felt different after Larry left. Quieter, but also lighter somehow, like we could finally breathe without someone watching and judging every move. Mom and I made breakfast together the next morning, something we hadn't done in years. She asked about my job, my apartment, my life, all the things Larry used to shut down or change the subject about. We talked for 2 hours over cold eggs and burnt toast. She told me how Larry would hide her phone when I called, how he'd delete my voicemails before she could hear them, how he convinced her I was busy with my own life and didn't want to be bothered with her problems. I explained how every time I tried to visit, he'd have some excuse ready about why it wasn't a good time. Rita set up a meeting with Orla for the following Monday. Mom was nervous about it, kept worrying that going after Larry legally would make everything worse. I reminded her about the $45,000 he stole, the credit cards, the lies about his job. She nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Years of Larry's manipulation didn't just disappear because he moved out. Mom went back to work that week. She was still tired from the pneumonia, still coughing sometimes, but she said staying home made her think too much. Her coworker Fiorella pulled her aside at lunch and told her everyone at the office had noticed things. How Larry would show up during Mom's lunch breaks and sit there the whole time. How he'd call the office phone if Mom didn't answer her cell within 5 minutes. How he'd pick her up after work and wait in the parking lot if she was running late. Fiorella said she almost said something a dozen times but didn't want to overstep or make things awkward. Now she felt awful for staying quiet. Mom told Fiorella she didn't blame her because Larry was good at making his control look like love and devotion. Even Mom herself didn't see it clearly until she was lying in that hospital bed with nobody visiting and time to actually think. Fiorella hugged her and said if Mom needed anything, rides to appointments or just someone to talk to, she was there. Mom came home that night looking exhausted but also kind of relieved, like having someone else confirm what happened made it more real. 2 weeks after Larry moved out, his brother called. Mom put the phone on speaker so I could hear. Larry's brother said they should talk reasonably about the divorce, that maybe they could work something out without lawyers getting involved. He suggested Larry deserved at least half of everything since they'd been married 7 years, and he'd supported Mom emotionally through hard times. I felt my blood pressure spike, but Mom stayed calm. She told him Larry stole $45,000 from her accounts, destroyed her credit score, and cut her off from her family for years. If he wanted to help his brother, he should tell Larry to accept the divorce terms quietly before she pressed criminal charges. Larry's brother stuttered that Larry made some mistakes, but didn't deserve to have his whole life ruined over money problems. Mom's voice got harder then. She said Larry didn't just make mistakes. He systematically ruined her financial security and emotional health for years while pretending to love her. The call ended with him hanging up on her. Mom set the phone down and her hands were shaking, but she looked proud of herself for not backing down. I told her she handled it perfectly, and she smiled. This small, tired smile that made me want to drive to Larry's brother's house and punch him. Orla filed the divorce papers 3 days later. She cited problems they couldn't fix and asked for all the assets to go to Mom based on Larry's fraud and theft. Larry had 30 days to respond. Orla warned us he'd probably fight everything even though he had no legal ground to stand on. She said guys like Larry never went quietly. They had to make everything difficult right up until the end. Rita connected Mom with a financial advisor named Melinda. They met at Melinda's office downtown, and I went along for support. Melinda spent 2 hours going through every account, every credit card, every loan and transaction we could find. She made notes on a yellow legal pad, her face getting more serious as the numbers added up. When she finished, she told Mom it would take about 5 years to fully recover financially, maybe longer if more surprises came up. Mom looked like she might cry, but held it together. Melinda said the first step was closing every joint account and opening new ones in Mom's name only. They spent the next hour on the phone with banks, putting fraud alerts on Mom's credit reports and disputing charges. That's when they found another loan. Larry had taken out a personal loan for $8,000 using Mom's information as a co-signer. She never signed anything, never even knew about it. Melinda's jaw tightened and she told Mom this was definitely criminal fraud, not just a civil matter anymore. The total theft was now $53,000. I took a week off work to help Mom sort through the house. We went room by room, bagging up anything that belonged to Larry or reminded her of him. Clothes he'd left behind, toiletries, books, random junk he'd collected over the years. We filled 7 garbage bags and loaded them in my car. I drove to his brother's house and left everything on the porch with a note saying pick it up within 3 days or it goes to charity. His brother's car was in the driveway, but nobody came out. I didn't care. Back at Mom's house the next weekend, she told me she couldn't sleep in the bedroom anymore. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Larry sitting on his side of the bed, going through her mail, hiding bills. The room felt wrong. We drove to the hardware store and picked out paint samples, settling on a soft blue that reminded Mom of the ocean. She said she wanted the room to feel calm and clean, nothing like the years she spent there with Larry. We spent Saturday moving furniture into the hallway, covering the floor with plastic sheets and taping off the trim. Mom rolled paint onto the walls while I cut in around the windows, both of us working in comfortable silence. By Sunday afternoon, we'd rearranged everything so the bed faced a different direction, bought new sheets and blankets that Larry had never touched, and hung different pictures on the walls. Mom stood in the doorway looking at the finished room and smiled for the first time since the confrontation. She said it finally felt like hers. While we were cleaning out the closet to make room for the new furniture arrangement, Mom pulled out a stack of Larry's old dress shirts he'd left behind. She started bagging them up when a small notebook fell out from between two shirts on the top shelf. Mom picked it up and flipped through the pages, her face going pale. She handed it to me without saying anything. The notebook had dates going back 3 years with detailed entries about Mom's work schedule, when she left the house, when she got home. There were notes about my phone calls with times and durations, and next to several entries Larry had written things like deflected successfully, or suggested she was tired. One page had a list of excuses he'd used to keep me from visiting. Another had notes about which of Mom's friends he'd convinced her to stop seeing. Seeing his manipulation written out like a project plan, methodical and calculated, made my hands shake. Mom sat down on the bed and stared at the wall. She wasn't crying anymore, just angry. She said she'd spent months making excuses for Larry, telling herself he was just protective or insecure. But this proved he knew exactly what he was doing. He'd isolated her on purpose, step by step, and documented his success. Mom called Orla the next morning and told her about the notebook. She said she wanted to pursue criminal charges after all because Larry's actions weren't mistakes or poor judgment. They were deliberate and planned. Orla asked if Mom was certain because criminal prosecution would be harder and take longer than just the divorce. But Mom didn't hesitate. She said she needed Larry to face real consequences for what he'd done to her and to our relationship. Orla said she'd connect us with a detective who handled financial fraud and elder abuse cases, and we should bring all the documentation we'd collected plus the notebook. 2 days later, we met with the detective at the police station. He was older, maybe in his 50s, and spent the first few minutes asking Mom general questions about her health and whether she felt safe. Then he went through everything we'd documented, making notes on a legal pad while Mom explained each theft, each lie, each manipulation. He asked specific questions about the credit cards, the retirement account withdrawal, the jewelry that disappeared. The interview took 2 hours, and by the end, Mom looked exhausted. The detective told her the case was strong, especially with Larry's notebook showing intent and planning, but he warned that prosecution could take months or even over a year. He said Mom needed to be absolutely certain she wanted to proceed because it would be draining and Larry's lawyer would try to make her look unreliable or vindictive. Mom looked at me, then back at the detective. She said she was certain. She wanted Larry held accountable for stealing her money, destroying her credit, and cutting her off from her family for years. The detective slid a formal complaint form across the table, and Mom signed it without reading it twice. I watched her hand move across the paper, steady and sure, and felt something shift. This wasn't the woman who'd apologized for Larry's behavior or asked me to visit less. This was someone demanding justice. We left the station, and Mom was quiet in the car, but she looked lighter somehow, like she'd set down something heavy she'd been carrying. 3 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived at Mom's house. She opened it at the kitchen table while I made coffee, then called me over. Larry's response to the divorce papers contested everything. His lawyer claimed Larry was entitled to half of all assets, including Mom's retirement account, the house, and her savings. The response argued that Larry had contributed to the household and supported Mom emotionally throughout their marriage, helping her through difficult times. There was no mention of the unemployment, the theft, or the credit card fraud. Mom read the whole thing twice, her jaw getting tighter with each page. She said Larry was still lying, still trying to rewrite history, and make himself the victim. His lawyer was ignoring that Larry had been jobless for 6 months while spending her money and hiding bills. I told her not to worry because we had bank statements, credit reports, and Larry's own notebook proving everything. Mom nodded, but I could see the stress in her shoulders. Orla called that afternoon to discuss Larry's response. She wasn't surprised he contested everything and said guys like Larry never went quietly. She explained that the court required mediation before the divorce could proceed to trial, so we'd need to sit down with Larry and a mediator to try reaching a settlement. Orla warned that Larry would likely try to manipulate Mom during mediation, using the same tactics he'd used throughout their marriage. She told Mom to stay focused on the facts we'd documented and not let Larry's emotional manipulation work on her. Mom agreed, but I could hear the worry in her voice. Orla scheduled the mediation for 2 weeks out and said she'd meet with us beforehand to prepare. The night before mediation, Mom barely slept. She came downstairs at 2 in the morning and found me on the couch. She admitted she was scared of seeing Larry again, worried that being in the same room with him would make her fall back into old patterns. She said for 7 years, giving in to Larry had been easier than fighting, and she was afraid that instinct would kick in when he started talking. I reminded her of everything we'd found: the notebook with his calculated plans, the bank statements showing theft, his attempts to gaslight her about her memory. I told her Larry only had power over her when she was isolated and confused, but now she had documentation, witnesses, and people supporting her. Mom nodded and said she knew that logically, but emotionally she still felt like the woman who'd believed his lies. I stayed up with her until 4, going through the bank statements again and reminding her of specific things Larry had done. By the time the sun came up, Mom looked more determined than scared. The mediation happened in a conference room at the courthouse. Larry was already sitting at the table when we arrived with Orla. He looked terrible, like he hadn't been sleeping or eating properly. His shirt was wrinkled and he'd lost weight. The mediator, a woman in her 40s, explained the process and asked both sides to present their positions. Larry's lawyer went first, arguing that Larry deserved half of everything because marriage was a partnership, and he'd supported Mom emotionally. Then Larry spoke directly to Mom, his voice soft and sad. He said he only took the money because he was depressed about losing his job and made poor decisions, but he'd always planned to pay it back. He said he loved her and never meant to hurt her. I felt Mom tense beside me and squeezed her hand under the table. Orla responded by presenting the bank statements, credit card records, and Larry's notebook. She laid out every theft, every lie, every manipulation in chronological order. Larry's face went red when she read from his notebook about deflecting my calls and isolating Mom from her friends. The mediator asked Larry about the credit cards and the jewelry. Larry looked at Mom with those same puppy dog eyes he'd used for years and said she'd given him permission for everything. He claimed she was only saying otherwise now because I'd turned her against him and poisoned their relationship. He said Mom was confused and didn't remember their conversations about money. Mom's voice shook when she responded, but she spoke clearly. She said she never gave Larry permission to take out credit cards in her name, never agreed to let him withdraw money from her retirement account, and never told him he could sell her jewelry. She said the bank statements proved Larry had concealed the transactions and forged her signature on documents. The mediator asked if she had proof of forgery, and Orla pulled out copies of signature cards from the bank, showing the differences between Mom's actual signature and the ones on Larry's withdrawal forms. Larry's face went dark red when the mediator set down the signature comparison sheets. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, and Larry shook his head hard. The mediator asked if we wanted to take a break, but Orla said no, we were ready to continue. Larry's lawyer cleared his throat and said perhaps they could discuss a settlement that would be fair to both parties without dragging this through expensive court proceedings. He suggested Larry receive $20,000 and sign away all claims to the house and retirement accounts. Orla didn't even look at Mom before responding. She said we'd see them in court where the criminal charges would also be addressed. Larry's lawyer tried again, saying litigation costs would eat up more than $20,000, and Mom should consider the practical aspects. Orla packed up her folders and told the mediator we were done here. Mom stood up without waiting for anyone's permission and walked out of the room. I followed her into the hallway where she was leaning against the wall taking deep breaths. She said she almost fell for it when Larry's lawyer mentioned the costs. I reminded her that Orla knew what she was doing and Mom had already paid enough. Orla joined us a minute later and said the divorce would proceed to trial in about 3 months. The criminal investigation was moving forward separately, and the detective would keep us updated. Mom looked exhausted, her shoulders sagging under her jacket. I promised to be there for every court date and hearing no matter what. 2 weeks passed and I drove down every Friday after work. Mom seemed lighter each time I saw her, like she was remembering who she'd been before Larry. We established new routines that felt good and normal. Sunday morning breakfast together became our thing. Just scrambled eggs and toast, but we'd talk for hours. Evening walks around the neighborhood started happening too, something Mom had stopped doing because Larry said exercise was pointless at her age. She told me how Larry used to criticize everything she did, making her feel stupid for wanting to take care of herself. Now she walked every evening whether I was there or not. Her coworker Fiorella started joining her sometimes, and Mom said it felt good to have a friend again. One Tuesday afternoon, Mom called me at work sounding scared. Larry had shown up at her office trying to talk to her. Security had escorted him out, but Mom was shaking. I told her to call the police immediately and report the violation of the no-contact order Orla had filed. Mom did, and I stayed on the phone with her until the officers arrived. She gave her statement with trembling hands, but her voice stayed steady. The old version of herself would have minimized what happened or made excuses for Larry. This version told the truth clearly. The police issued Larry a formal warning and said any further contact would result in arrest. Mom called me that night and said she felt proud of herself for not backing down. I told her I was proud too. That weekend, I helped Mom sort through old photo albums and pack away pictures that included Larry. She didn't want reminders of him in her daily view. We found her wedding album buried in a closet, and Mom asked if I wanted to burn it in the fireplace. I said only if she wanted to. She held it for a long time before putting it in a box for the attic instead. She said maybe someday she'd be ready, but not yet. Rita came over Saturday with groceries and stayed for dinner. She told Mom that several of her old friends had been asking about her. Mom admitted she was nervous about reconnecting because she'd let those friendships die during the marriage. Rita said real friends understood and would be happy to see her again. Mom decided to reach out to a few people she'd been close with before Larry. The responses shocked her. Everyone wanted to get together and catch up. Several admitted they'd noticed concerning signs but didn't know how to bring it up without seeming judgmental of her marriage. One friend said she'd called a few times years ago, but Larry always said Mom was busy and would call back. She never did because Larry never gave her the messages. Rita organized a small gathering at Mom's house with 4 of her closest old friends. I stayed in the kitchen making coffee and putting out cookies while they talked in the living room. Mom's laugh came through the doorway, genuine and light. I hadn't heard that sound in years. When I brought the coffee tray in, all 5 women were crying and hugging. Mom introduced me to everyone, and they told stories about things Mom used to do before the marriage: volunteer work at the library, book club meetings, weekend hiking trips, all things Larry had slowly eliminated from her life. Mom looked fragile sitting there surrounded by people who actually cared about her well-being, but she also looked happy in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. After everyone left, Mom and I cleaned up together, and she thanked me for not giving up on her. I told her I'd never stop fighting for us. The detective called 3 weeks later asking Mom and me to come to his office. He had new information from the subpoenaed bank records. We drove there together and he spread printouts across his desk showing online gambling transactions. $45,000 had disappeared into various casino websites over 6 months. The detective explained this added another layer to Larry's deception and helped establish a clear pattern of theft rather than poor financial decisions. Mom stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. She kept saying she had no idea. She never saw any of this. The detective assured her that was the point of Larry's isolation tactics. He didn't want anyone looking at the finances closely enough to notice. The detective said the criminal case was strong and they'd be moving forward with formal charges soon. He warned that Larry's lawyer might try to negotiate a plea deal to avoid trial. Mom nodded but didn't say anything. Sure enough, Larry's lawyer contacted Orla the next week. He wanted to discuss a plea deal on the criminal charges in exchange for Larry accepting the divorce terms without contest. Orla called Mom and explained the offer carefully. A plea deal would mean certainty and closure, but potentially lighter consequences for Larry. If they went to trial, Larry might face harsher penalties, but there was always the risk a jury could be sympathetic. Mom asked what Orla recommended, and Orla said it was entirely Mom's choice. This wasn't about legal strategy. It was about what Mom needed emotionally. Mom said she needed time to think about it. She spent the next several days going back and forth. One minute she wanted Larry to face full consequences for what he did. The next minute she just wanted it over, so she could move on with her life. I drove down Thursday evening and found her sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread everywhere. She said she kept trying to decide what was right but couldn't figure it out. I sat down across from her and told her there was no wrong choice. Whatever she decided, I'd support completely. This wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about what would let her heal and rebuild. Mom cried and said she didn't know who she was anymore after 7 years of Larry telling her what to think and feel. I said she was figuring that out and doing an amazing job. The decision was hers alone, and I trusted her completely. Mom called Orla the next morning and said she wanted to accept the plea deal. Her voice sounded tired but certain when she explained that dragging this through criminal trials for another year would just keep Larry in her life longer. She wanted him gone, wanted to move forward, wanted to stop living in the past. Orla said she understood completely and would contact Larry's lawyer to finalize the terms. The plea deal went through faster than expected. Larry appeared in court 2 weeks later and admitted guilt to fraud and theft charges in front of a judge. Mom didn't attend because Orla said she didn't have to, that watching Larry perform remorse would just upset her. The judge sentenced him to 2 years probation and ordered a payment plan for $45,000, $375 monthly for 10 years. Mom laughed when Orla called with the news because that amount would barely cover interest on what he stole, but at least it was something. The divorce followed immediately after the criminal case closed. Orla filed the final paperwork, and Larry's lawyer didn't contest anything this time, probably because Larry was too busy dealing with probation requirements to fight. Mom kept the house, her retirement account, every asset they'd accumulated during the marriage. Larry got stuck with all the credit card debt he'd created, and the restitution payments on top of it. The divorce decree arrived in Mom's mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon. I was there when she opened it, standing in the kitchen while she pulled out the official document with the court seal. She read through it twice, then started crying right there at the counter. But these tears looked different from all the others I'd seen over the past months. She was smiling while she cried, holding the papers against her chest like they were precious. She told me she felt free for the first time in 7 years. That night, Mom went to the craft store and bought a simple black frame. She put the divorce decree inside and hung it on her bedroom wall where she'd see it every morning. Rita thought it was weird when she came over, but Mom explained it reminded her that she survived, that she got herself out, that she reclaimed her own life from someone who tried to take everything. Melinda came to the house the following week with a laptop and calculator. She spread financial documents across the dining room table and walked Mom through creating a realistic budget. They calculated every expense, every bill, every necessary cost. Melinda showed Mom how much she needed for basic living and how much she could save if she cut back on things Larry used to insist on, like expensive restaurants and unnecessary subscriptions. Mom decided to pick up extra shifts at work, 2 additional evenings per week that would add about $600 monthly to her income. Melinda helped her open a new retirement account at a different bank, one Larry had never touched and never would. Mom transferred money from each paycheck automatically so she wouldn't even see it, wouldn't be tempted to spend it. The plan would take 5 years to fully recover what Larry stole. But Mom felt good having concrete steps forward instead of just dwelling on what was lost. 3 months passed and Mom settled into her new routine. She worked her extra shifts, paid down the credit cards methodically, started rebuilding her credit score point by point. Then one evening her phone rang with a number she recognized. Desmond. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. His voice sounded rough and apologetic when he started talking. He said he needed to tell her he was sorry for defending Larry, for being hostile toward me, for not believing her when everything first came out. Larry had gotten drunk at Desmond's place the week before and admitted everything during a breakdown. Told Desmond about the gambling, the lies, the systematic way he isolated Mom from everyone who cared about her. Desmond said he felt sick knowing he'd defended that behavior and attacked the people trying to help. Mom listened quietly while he talked, then told him she understood. Family loyalty made people want to believe the best about their relatives, even when evidence pointed elsewhere. She didn't hold it against him. Desmond said he'd cut Larry off financially, and told him to get therapy and find a job. Hearing that gave Mom a small sense of satisfaction, knowing Larry was finally facing real consequences from his own family. I drove down the next weekend to help Mom set up online banking properly. We sat at her computer and created alerts for every single transaction, every deposit, every withdrawal, every purchase over $5. Her phone would notify her immediately if anything moved in her accounts. Mom admitted she felt paranoid about money now, checking her balance multiple times daily, saving every receipt, tracking every penny. I told her Melinda said that was completely normal after financial abuse, that the paranoia would fade over time as she rebuilt trust in her own financial security. We changed all her passwords, set up 2-factor verification, made sure nobody could access anything without her knowledge. Mom wrote everything down in a notebook she kept locked in her desk drawer. The paranoia wasn't the only thing Mom needed help with. Rita found her a therapist who worked specifically with people recovering from emotional abuse and manipulation. Mom started going every Tuesday evening after work. The first few sessions were rough, according to what she told me later. The therapist made her examine how she'd allowed herself to be isolated, how she'd ignored warning signs, how she'd chosen Larry over her own daughter repeatedly. Mom cried through most of those early appointments, confronting painful truths about her own choices. But she kept going back week after week because she wanted to understand what happened and make sure she never fell into that pattern again. 6 months after Larry moved out, I came down for a regular weekend visit and barely recognized Mom when she answered the door. She'd gained back the weight she lost during the pneumonia. Her face had color again instead of that gray, exhausted look, and when she smiled, it reached her eyes for the first time in years. We spent Saturday working in the garden she'd let die during the marriage because Larry said yard work was pointless. She planted tomatoes and herbs, getting dirt under her fingernails and laughing when I accidentally sprayed her with the hose. That evening, we cooked dinner together in her kitchen, something simple but good, and talked about everything happening in our lives. She told me about a project at work, about a funny thing Rita said, about progress she was making in therapy. Normal conversation between a mother and daughter without Larry's shadow hanging over everything. Sunday morning, Mom suggested we take a trip together, just the 2 of us, something we hadn't done since before she married Larry. She wanted to go to the beach for a weekend, stay in a cheap hotel, walk on the sand, eat seafood, remember what it felt like to enjoy each other's company. We picked a date 3 weeks out and Mom booked everything herself, using money from her own account that nobody else controlled. When the weekend came, we drove to the coast together and spent 2 days doing absolutely nothing important. We walked along the water talking about my job and her therapy and Rita's dating disasters. We ate fried clams at a place with plastic tables and paper plates. We watched the sunset from our hotel balcony drinking cheap wine from plastic cups. None of it was fancy or expensive or impressive, but we were together without anyone controlling when we could talk, or what we could say, or how long we could spend in each other's company. Mom told me this felt like getting a piece of herself back that she'd forgotten existed. I told her we were rebuilding something Larry tried to destroy but couldn't, because real love between a mother and daughter was stronger than one man's need for control. During the beach trip, Mom brought up something I wasn't expecting while we sat on the hotel balcony watching the ocean. She told me she'd started seeing someone from work, a guy named James who worked in the IT department. She looked nervous telling me, like she was worried I'd be angry or tell her it was too soon. I asked her what he was like and she relaxed a little, explaining that he was kind and respectful, that he encouraged her to spend time with Rita and her other friends instead of trying to monopolize her attention. She said he'd asked about me multiple times, wanted to know when he could meet me, seemed genuinely interested in her having a relationship with her daughter. I told her I was cautious but happy for her, that she deserved someone who treated her well. Mom reached over and squeezed my hand, promising she'd learned the warning signs now and wouldn't ignore red flags again. She said her therapist had helped her recognize the difference between healthy concern and controlling behavior, between wanting to spend time together and demanding isolation from everyone else. I believed her because I could see how much work she'd put into understanding what happened with Larry. 2 weeks after we got back from the beach, Rita threw Mom what she called a divorce party at her house. She invited all Mom's friends, the ones she'd reconnected with and the new ones she'd made since Larry left. The whole thing was silly and fun in the best way possible. Rita had made a cake decorated with the words, "Freedom at last," in bright red icing. Someone brought a piñata shaped like a groom that everyone took turns hitting with a bat. Mom's friend from work brought a box of Larry's old belongings that Mom had forgotten to give back, and they took turns suggesting increasingly ridiculous ways to dispose of them. Burn them, donate them to a thrift store in another state, use them as kindling for a bonfire. Mom laughed so hard she started crying, the good kind of tears that come from joy instead of pain. She kept saying she couldn't believe how supportive everyone was being, how lucky she felt to have friends who celebrated this moment with her, instead of judging her for the divorce. I watched her surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her well-being, and felt grateful that she'd found her way back to this kind of community after years of isolation. 3 weeks later, Mom received the first restitution payment from Larry in the mail. She called me right away, her voice flat with disappointment. $300. That was what Larry had sent, the bare minimum required by his payment plan. At the rate he was going, it would take him 12.5 years to repay the $45,000 he'd stolen, and that was assuming he never missed a payment. Mom drove straight to the bank and deposited the check, then called Melinda to update her on the payment. She told Melinda she wasn't counting on Larry's restitution money for her financial recovery, that she was building her plan around what she could control and earn herself. Melinda praised her for having realistic expectations and reminded her that the court-ordered payments were just a bonus, not the foundation of her rebuilding strategy. Mom sounded tired but determined when we talked that evening. She said seeing that pathetic $300 check actually strengthened her resolve to become financially independent again, to never rely on anyone else to fix what Larry had broken. A month after that conversation, I got called into my manager's office at work. I'd been nervous all morning thinking I'd done something wrong, but instead she offered me a promotion to senior analyst with a significant raise. I accepted immediately and spent the rest of the day in a daze, barely able to focus on my work. That weekend, I drove down to see Mom and brought my first bigger paycheck with me. I'd already written a check for $2,000, the full balance of one of the credit cards Larry had maxed out in Mom's name. When I handed it to her, she immediately tried to give it back, saying I needed to save my money and build my own financial security. I refused to take it back and told her that supporting each other was what family did, that she'd supported me through college and my early career struggles, and now it was my turn to help her. Mom started crying and pulled me into a tight hug, saying she didn't deserve a daughter like me after pushing me away for so many years. I told her to stop punishing herself for what Larry had orchestrated, that we were moving forward together now, and that was what mattered. Mom's therapy sessions continued every Tuesday evening, and over the next few months she started opening up to me about what she was working through with her therapist. The guilt she carried about choosing Larry over our relationship had been eating at her since the hospital, making her question whether she was a good mother at all. Her therapist helped her understand that she'd been a victim of systematic manipulation and isolation, that Larry had used specific tactics to separate her from the people who cared about her most. The therapist explained that financial abusers often target their victims' closest relationships first, creating dependency and removing support systems that might help the victim recognize what was happening. Mom said hearing that she wasn't just weak or stupid, that she'd been deliberately targeted and manipulated by someone skilled at emotional abuse, helped her separate her choices from her character. She was learning to forgive herself for not seeing through Larry's tactics sooner, for believing his lies about me being too demanding or making her feel guilty. The therapy was hard work, but I could see it changing how Mom talked about herself and the marriage, replacing shame with understanding. 5 months after the divorce was finalized, Mom drove up to visit me at my place for a long weekend. It was the first time she'd made the trip in years, the first time she'd seen where I actually lived and spent time in my space. I introduced her to my friends over dinner Friday night, and she charmed everyone with stories from her work and questions about their lives. Saturday, we explored the downtown area near my apartment, visiting shops and cafes I'd wanted to show her for years. She met my neighbor who I'd become close with, saw the community garden where I volunteered on weekends, walked through the park where I ran most mornings. Sunday morning before she left, Mom sat on my couch drinking coffee and told me how proud she was of the person I'd become despite Larry's efforts to keep us apart. She said seeing my life, my friends, my independence made her realize I'd built something good for myself, even during those years when we barely spoke. I told her I'd always known she loved me even when Larry was controlling our contact, that I'd held on to that knowledge through all the missed calls and canceled visits. Mom hugged me goodbye in my doorway and promised to come back soon, said she wanted this to become a regular thing where we spent time in each other's spaces instead of always meeting in her town where everything reminded her of the past. 2 weeks after her visit, Mom started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter downtown. She'd found the organization through her therapist, who suggested that sharing her story might help her healing process. Mom went through their volunteer training program and started working with women who were experiencing financial abuse and isolation, similar to what she'd endured. She called me after her first shift sounding energized in a way I hadn't heard in years. She'd talked with 3 different women about the warning signs she'd missed, the ways Larry had gradually increased his control, the tactics he'd used to separate her from family and friends. The women had recognized their own situations in Mom's story, had asked questions about how she'd finally broken free and started rebuilding. Mom said helping others recognize the patterns she'd been blind to gave her a sense of purpose and healing she hadn't found anywhere else. She felt like her experience with Larry, as painful as it had been, could now serve a purpose in protecting other women from similar abuse. A year after I'd confronted Larry with those bank statements, Mom called me with news about her financial recovery. She'd just met with Melinda for their quarterly review and had paid off 2 of the fraudulent credit cards completely. Her credit score had climbed 70 points from its lowest point, still damaged but improving steadily each month. Melinda told her she was ahead of schedule on the recovery plan they'd created, that at this rate Mom would be back to financial stability within 3 years, instead of the original 5-year estimate. Mom's voice filled with pride as she described seeing those zero balances on accounts that had once been maxed out with Larry's spending. She'd been picking up extra shifts at work, cutting unnecessary expenses, following Melinda's budget religiously. The progress gave her confidence that she could rebuild her financial future on her own terms, that Larry's theft wouldn't define the rest of her life. Then Larry violated his probation by missing 3 consecutive restitution payments and failing to complete the required counseling sessions the court had ordered. His probation officer filed a violation report, and the judge sentenced him to 30 days in jail. Mom found out when the prosecutor's office called to inform her about the sentencing. She thanked them for letting her know and hung up feeling a complicated mix of emotions. Part of her felt satisfied that Larry was facing real consequences for continuing to ignore his legal obligations. But mostly she felt nothing, realized she'd spent weeks without thinking about him at all, that he'd become irrelevant to her daily life. She told me that evening that the jail sentence felt like justice, but also like closing a chapter that was already finished. Larry wasn't taking up space in her thoughts anymore, wasn't controlling her emotions or decisions, had become just a mistake she'd learned from rather than the center of her world. Mom and I established a new tradition over the following months, monthly dinners where we cooked together at her place and talked about everything happening in our lives. We'd pick a recipe neither of us had tried before, shop for ingredients together, spend the evening in her kitchen making a mess and laughing at our mistakes. During these dinners, we talked about my job and her volunteering, her therapy progress and my dating life, Rita's latest drama, and plans for upcoming holidays. The easy communication we'd lost during Larry's manipulation had fully returned, stronger now because we'd fought to reclaim it, and both understood how precious it was. Mom would sometimes reference something from the years when Larry kept us apart, and instead of avoiding the topic, we'd talk about it honestly, acknowledging the pain, but also celebrating how far we'd come. These monthly dinners became the anchor of our rebuilt relationship, proof that real love between a mother and daughter was stronger than one man's need for control. Mom signed up for an introduction to art history class at the community college that fall. She'd mentioned wanting to study art years ago, back before Larry told her she was too old to waste time on hobbies when she should focus on taking care of the house. I helped her register online and drove her to campus the first night, watching her walk into the building with her new notebook and pens looking nervous but excited. She called me after that first class talking faster than I'd heard in years, telling me about Renaissance paintings and a discussion about symbolism in religious art. The professor had asked the class to share why they were interested in art history, and Mom said she'd been honest about Larry discouraging her interests for years and wanting to reclaim parts of herself she'd lost. 3 other women came up to her after class saying they related to her story, that they'd also put their own interests aside for partners or family. Mom started meeting these women for coffee before class each week, forming friendships based on shared experiences and genuine support, rather than the surface-level relationships Larry had allowed. She'd come home from class energized, telling me about debates over artistic movements and group projects analyzing famous works. Her world was expanding beyond the small, isolated circle Larry had created, and I could hear the difference in her voice every time we talked. 6 months into her art history class, Mom mentioned she'd been seeing someone from work and wanted me to meet him officially. I drove down the following weekend feeling cautious, but trying to stay open-minded for her sake. His name was James, and he worked in the accounting department at Mom's company. They'd known each other casually for years, but only started talking more after Larry left, and Mom returned to work full-time. James showed up at Mom's house with flowers and a bottle of wine, shaking my hand and asking genuine questions about my job and life 3 hours away. He didn't hover over Mom or interrupt when she talked, didn't try to control the conversation or steer topics away from me. When Mom mentioned our monthly dinner tradition, James said he thought it was wonderful that we'd rebuilt our relationship and he'd never want to interfere with our time together. The contrast to Larry's behavior hit me hard, remembering how Larry had systematically worked to keep us apart, while James actively encouraged Mom to maintain close family connections. We spent the evening talking easily, and James shared stories about his own family and asked my opinion on things rather than dominating every discussion. After he left, Mom asked what I thought, and I told her honestly that he seemed kind and respectful, that I was cautiously optimistic, but glad she was taking things slow. She promised she'd learned the warning signs and wouldn't ignore red flags again, that therapy had taught her what healthy relationships looked like. 2 years after I'd confronted Larry with those bank statements and watched Mom tell him to leave, she decided to host Thanksgiving at her house. She invited Rita, me, James, Fiorella from work, and several friends she'd made through her art history class and volunteer work at the shelter. I arrived early to help cook and found Mom in the kitchen surrounded by ingredients, looking happier and more confident than I'd seen since before she married Larry. We spent the morning preparing food together, talking and laughing while the house filled with cooking smells. Guests started arriving around noon, and the house came alive with conversation and warmth, so different from the tense, silent holidays I'd spent alone when Larry whisked Mom away on trips. Rita brought her famous sweet potato casserole and told embarrassing stories about Mom from their childhood. Fiorella shared how much Mom's friendship had meant to her over the past 2 years, how inspiring it was to watch her reclaim her independence. James fit naturally into the group, helping serve food and making everyone feel comfortable. After dinner, Mom pulled me aside into her bedroom where we could talk privately. She told me she finally felt like herself again after years of losing her identity to Larry's control, that she could look in the mirror and recognize the person staring back. She said hosting this Thanksgiving surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her well-being felt like proof she'd survived and rebuilt something beautiful from the damage Larry had caused. Later that evening, after everyone else had left and James had gone home, Mom and I stood in her kitchen washing dishes together and talking about plans for Christmas. The sink was full of plates and serving bowls, evidence of the full house and successful celebration. Mom's hands were in soapy water scrubbing a roasting pan while I dried wine glasses and put them back in the cabinet. She turned to me suddenly with tears in her eyes and thanked me for not giving up on her even when she'd pushed me away, for driving down that Sunday without warning and forcing a conversation that broke through Larry's isolation. She said she knew she'd hurt me by choosing Larry and asking me to visit less, that she'd spent hours in therapy working through the guilt of failing to protect our relationship. I set down the glass I was holding and told her she didn't fail me, that Larry was a skilled manipulator who'd systematically separated her from everyone who loved her. I said I'd always fight for our relationship because that's what real love looks like, not the possessive control Larry had disguised as devotion. Mom hugged me tight, and we stood there in her kitchen holding each other while dish soap bubbles popped in the sink and leftover pumpkin pie sat covered on the counter. The house was quiet now, but still warm from the day's gathering, and I realized this moment was what we'd been fighting toward all along.